1. We are all connected. Once when I was teaching a large group workshop, I noticed a little card. On it was a poem or prayer that read, "Buddha nature pervades the whole universe, existing right here and now. I dedicate the merit of this practice to all sentient beings. Together we realize liberation." As I read these words, I realized that this is true for everyone and everything. You can substitute, instead of Buddha nature, if you feel more comfortable, the word love, or God, or Jesus, or higher power, or any other spiritual figure. It does not matter. It simply means a kind, wise, and loving energy, perhaps with attributes beyond which we can comprehend, that fills the atoms and molecules and energetic particles of the whole universe, an energy from which we are made and precipitated in a sense. This energy, this Buddha or God nature, exists right here and now, everywhere and all the time. You can dedicate the practice of your daily life to bringing about in a compassionate manner the advancement of all sentient beings, that is, all things that have consciousness. Together, because every one of us is connected, we can realize liberation, which is freedom from the process of birth and death and rebirth, so that we can graduate from the school that we call Earth. That word together, that one simple word, is crucial. There is such a sacred energy in the gathering of the group. As the stories in this chapter illustrate, it is no accident, no coincidence that specific people come together at a certain time and for a collective purpose. Some of the authors of these stories are able to divine the intricate, infinite threads that tie each one of us to another. Others who call themselves strangers find that they have been intimately linked throughout their lifetimes. There are no strangers. There is no separateness. No one stands alone. For example, any particular group of people who are attending one of my workshops is not truly random. They are already connected to each other even before they have assembled, pulled in by some greater coordinating force. It's as if a cosmic magnet attracts those specific souls that are needed for that workshop. Soulmates and others, some of whom have shared past lives but have not yet met in the present one, are brought together. These unions are actually reunions. As I looked at the card, I remember thinking, how important this little prayer is. Then, as I was teaching the course, with the words of this prayer still resonating in my mind, I understood that the 130 people who had come to this intensive course were assembled not just for their own purposes, and not just to experience a past life. What if God or a higher power had assembled these 130 people to heal 3 or 4? What if the intention was, well, let's get these particular 130 people and their unique energy to heal these 3 or 4 among their group who are in need? What a privilege, what an honor, and what a blessing it would be to be included among those 130 people. That gave a different perspective to me and to the entire group. We realized that miracles were happening. We merely had to open our eyes. The fabric of connection. In 1993, I was given many lives, many masters by a stranger who knew nothing of me, but said that it was for me. It made everything in my life prior to that finally make sense. Not so much my experience with past lives, as much as personal conflicts that I felt with the common perception of grief. For the first time in my life, I felt validated for not feeling completely stricken with loss when someone passed away. I had a resonating knowing that if I could only work with you and learn from you, I could help others to shift their perspective from pain back to connection. More than 10 years later, my husband, a California Highway Patrol officer, was killed in pursuit. 2 years after that, I saw you on the Oprah Winfrey Show, and that same resonating feeling of knowing came through me as I watched. With your July Omega professional training only weeks away, I booked everything within minutes. It was as easy as water flowing. When I arrived at Omega, my psychic awareness was completely blown open as never before. I was as aware of my connection not only to all others there, but also with the little animals and plants. You agreed to demonstrate a regression on me in front of the entire group. As you did a rapid induction, I immediately saw the word trough galloping through my awareness, and then saw the actual trough we used for our horses' water on the farm on which I grew up. I was led through a childhood memory of being forced by circumstance to sell our beloved horses. I remembered witnessing the pain this had also brought my father, how he had related to my mother that his instincts told him not to sell the horses to that particular buyer, and how he had ignored those instincts with great regret. I had made a conscious decision to not cry in order to spare my father any additional guilt. From that moment as a child until I sat with you at Omega, even the thought of sadness in relation to that incident remained deep and anonymous inside me. The pain came flowing up from my diaphragm with each exhalation as I described what was happening. The combination of absolute shock and relief was indescribable. I went next to a memory of my son's birth, when my own instincts had screamed to me that something was wrong for weeks, yet I allowed myself to repeatedly be convinced by the doctor that I was simply paranoid. Finally, I pleaded with him to induce my labor, and he reluctantly agreed. But then I was thrown into an emergency cesarean section when arriving at the hospital. My son had needed to be resuscitated, gangrene infecting the entire placenta and umbilical cord. The next day, when he was finally stable enough for me to hold him, I looked down upon him and saw his little stained fingers. I knew that by ignoring my own intuition, which I should have trusted more than the air that I breathed, I had failed my first real test as a parent. I had begun to cry in anger, sadness, and frustration, the same way my father had when he sold our horses. Just then, my son began to fuss and move uncomfortably, and I realized he could feel this pain coming from me. Out of concern for causing any additional pain to him, I stopped crying and forgot the guilt completely, until those 14 years later, during my session. I released the extreme pain that I was completely unaware of harboring. Absolutely relieved, I felt as if the weight of the world had literally been lifted from my chest. I then became aware of my guide's presence, and the familiar sense of peace and belonging washed over me. They went on to make me aware that I was part of them, just as they were a part of me, and as I felt you to my right side, I realized that you too were a part of that team. You asked if my husband was there. Looking for the answer, I could feel him to my left, and I turned my head as if to bring him more clearly into my awareness. Just as I turned left, I also felt him in front of me. I turned my head forward, only to feel him to my right, yet still to my left and front. "He is everywhere," I said, as I realized what I had been feeling. Hearing this, the entire rest of the room of 130 people let out a collective sigh. In that moment, I became aware of energy, like blue threads that had been connecting me to each person in the room since our introductions had begun the night before, extending from my diaphragm to theirs individually. When they collectively sighed in response to their own emotions, which were stirred from sharing in my awareness of my late husband's presence, the threads shot out from each of them, from one another to one another, in a beautiful, simple, yet complicated fabric of connection. I became aware of the fact that everything I would go on to do from that moment would affect all these others, just as everything that they would go on to do would affect each of the others as well. Heal the healers was the awareness I had, with a knowing that in our connection was our strength. I tuned back in to hear you ask if my guides were still present. I responded that they were, and that they always are, and I said, "We are a team, and we have a purpose." You asked what the purpose was, and I began to see infinite flashes of scenes, only flashes, but with details and emotions attached to each. The few that I could capture involved a prisoner sitting on the side of his bunk, with his head in his hands, feeling more pain, fear, and anger toward himself than any of his victims could ever fathom, because even he did not know why he did the things he did, and so he could not trust his own actions. A mother holding her child, both of them starving to death. The mother choking on her own pain, knowing her child would die of malnourishment before her, fearing she would die believing her mother was selfish for not dying first. All I could verbally translate of these flashes was, the pain, so much pain, as I cried with such intensity that I felt as if I would split into pieces. All of the pain is from fear, misunderstandings, fearing and being feared, I said. I knew that the purpose, as you had asked, was to reduce the collective pain through eliminating fear, and through this an elevation of all living things would ensue. I understand now that being one is not a goal, it already is, and that everything that we do, even those seemingly small things that we do individually, does indeed directly affect us all. Nina Manny. In my lectures and workshops, I frequently talk about how we are all connected, how what one does affects everybody else. Nina says it beautifully. In our connection is our strength. The bonds that connect us are ones of loving spirituality. If we are of the same energy, composed of particle and wave, and not blood and bone, then what we do affects one another, and not just human beings. Our thoughts and actions have consequences, all the more reason to be loving and compassionate and not fearful or harmful. They create our destiny and our future. Nina's story wonderfully expands upon and explains the energetic cords that unite us. But there is so much more here. She perceives her late husband's ubiquitous and loving presence. She is aware of the constant eternal wisdom that grace, heaven's hand, provides us in various forms, whether through guides, angels, spiritual messengers, or in many other ways. She has recognized lifetimes filled with lessons, loss, pain, and hope. And she has reminded me of a long-ago message from a master, conveyed through Catherine, recorded on tape, and written in Many Lives, Many Masters. It is one that has nourished and motivated me ever since. You were correct in assuming this is the proper treatment for those in the physical state. You must eradicate the fears from their minds. It is a waste of energy when fear is present. It stifles them from fulfilling what they were sent here to fulfill. Energy. Everything is energy. So much is wasted. Inside the mountain it is quiet. It is calm at the center. But on the outside is where the trouble lies. Humans can only see the outside. You have to go deep inside. You must get rid of the fear. That will be the greatest weapon you have. It is what Nina reminds us. All of the pain is from fear. Love and understanding dissolve fear. The great teacher John Kabat-Zinn taught me a meditation of a mountain. I think of this often, for it helps me to understand how to stay grounded no matter what happens on the outside. I believe that it has been such a powerful image for me precisely because the masters had mentioned it so long ago in the quote. Picture a beautiful mountain, perhaps with a peak covered in snow. As you look at it, you can see that it has an inner core of constant peace and constant temperature, so that no matter what happens on the outside, the inside remains unchanged. Now imagine that the seasons come and go. Summer comes with lightning, with storms, with flooding and fires, yet inside the mountain remains completely still, tranquil, and calm. The summer becomes fall, with howling winds and leaves falling off the trees. Then winter arrives with snows and freezing temperatures, and this too turns to spring as the snows melt and avalanches occur. Yet the inner core, the beautiful space deep within the mountains, is unaffected by any of these changing seasons. We are like the mountain. We do not have to let outside events rob us of our joy and harmony, no matter how strongly the storms rage, no matter how loudly the winds howl. We all have that inner core of calm and quiet. It is there whenever we want or need it. By going inward, we can access its powerful healing presence. The mountain, inside, is perfect, and so are we. Envision now that tourists come to the mountain. They arrive by train, airplane, car, boat, and other ways. And they all have opinions. This mountain is not as beautiful as the one that I've seen elsewhere. It is too small, or too tall, or too narrow, or too wide. But the mountain does not care, because it knows that it is the ideal essence of mountain. We, once again, are like that mountain. No matter what people say about us, no matter what criticisms or judgments they may offer up and call mirrors, we are already ideal and divine. We do not have to be affected by their opinions, even those of people who are close to us, such as our family, our bosses, or our loved ones. In that sense, we are solid and grounded in the earth like the mountain. We know, deep within our hearts, that we are the perfect essence of a spiritual being. The words of others cannot rob us of our inner peace and joy unless we give them the power to do so. I often use this meditation to remind myself and others of our magnificence and nobility, just like the beautiful mountain. Although we have merely forgotten this, we are already perfect. We have always been so. Loved and worthy. The week at Omega in October 2010 touched and opened my heart in so many ways. It helped bring to my conscious mind so much that I had forgotten. There is a reawakening emerging in me that brings me to tears whenever I allow myself to sit still and realize how wondrous we all truly are. On the first morning, Dr. Weiss guided us into a group regression. This was not my first regression, and I was looking forward to another past life experience. I usually sense, feel, and visualize in sync with the words of the person guiding the journey. This time, however, to my surprise, I saw myself as I am in this life at my current age. I was standing in a space where everything just felt hazy. I looked in front of me, and there seemed to be a curtain of fog. A bare arm came through, took my hand, and brought me through the curtain. I found myself standing in front of an old friend, Joe, who had passed in the 1970s, when we were in our 20s. Joe and I had been very close. As a matter of fact, I had never been as close to anyone before or after him. We were friends, lovers, and confidants. We would talk for hours about the possibilities of life after death. We promised each other that whoever died first would come back to the other one and explain what it was like. Eventually, we got in our own way and went our separate ways, badly. About a year or two later, Joe and I spoke on the phone, and it was clear that whatever had come between us was not as strong now. He invited me to visit him the next time I was in Santa Barbara. I said that I would, but I didn't. I was afraid, and I told myself that I needed more time before I saw him face to face. Not long after that, I got a phone call from a mutual friend who told me that Joe had taken his life. I was in disbelief. I became mad, sad, and then mad again. If only I had called him when I was in Santa Barbara, then maybe this would not have happened. Time went on, and Joe kept his word. I would get visits from him, mostly at night, in vivid dreams. There were also the times, after I had spoken to someone about how angry I was that he took his life, when I would be woken up with my bed shaking, and I could hear his voice telling me not to be mad at him. I made myself stop voicing my anger out loud, and soon I realized that I just missed him. Eventually I told Joe I no longer wanted the dreams, and they stopped too. After that, from time to time, I felt Joe's energy around me. Just knowing that he was there was so reassuring. Then, one day, in the 1990s, I was in my kitchen, and I could feel Joe's energy surround me. It was around me and in me. I heard him tell me that he loved me, and that he was leaving this vibration and going to another dimension, where he had work to do. He told me he was going to be greeting the souls who had passed from AIDS. He showed me a quick glimpse of a space where there was so much sorrow, pain, and confusion. This was part of his debt, he said, for taking his own life. I felt his energy enveloping me and filling me with an unconditional love that I had never experienced before. Tears of joy streamed down my cheeks. I don't know how long I stood there before I again became aware that I was standing in my kitchen in the middle of the day. That was the last time I ever felt Joe's energy, until the group regression on the first morning of the training. There I was, standing in front of Joe. He took me to him and hugged me fully and unconditionally. He now had wings. He impressed upon me, without speaking, that he had progressed. I could feel him wrap his wings around me. It felt like there were other energies around us, also surrounding me in love. I heard the words, "You are loved, you are worthy." My jaw hurt, my throat was tight, my arms ached, and tears rushed into my eyes. Joe continued to hug me until I accepted and surrendered to the message, and at that moment the physical discomfort also stopped. A teacher came and put a light crystal in my heart. I followed Dr. Weiss's voice and opened my eyes. I was back. I didn't want to be back. It was lonely and cold here. That afternoon, I volunteered to be hypnotized in front of the group so that Dr. Weiss could demonstrate a rapid induction. It worked well. While I was in hypnosis, Dr. Weiss asked me about my morning journey. I told him about meeting Joe, although I purposely did not use his name, instead referring to him simply as a friend. I told him of the wings and of his message. I said that my friend had taken his life and that I hadn't gone to see him, as I'd promised I would. Dr. Weiss told me that I wasn't responsible and should not have any guilt for my friend having taken his life. To my friend I was, he said, loved and worthy. Immediately I felt a sense of relief. I hadn't consciously realized that I'd carried this burden of responsibility, but now that it was spoken, I could feel a layer of sadness being lifted. I could feel the emotion of the moment, yet I still sensed that I was holding back somewhat and not letting go entirely. Several days later, still during the training, a friend and I were on our way to the dining room for breakfast. A woman named Rachel was walking toward us on the path. She looked at me intently and asked, "Are you Jeanette?" When I said that I was, she said, "I have a message for you from Joe. He says he loves you." She told me that she had gotten this message and was compelled to find me to relay it. I thanked her with tears streaming down my cheeks. This was my confirmation. Joe knew me too well. He knew he would have to bring his message through someone else just to make sure I would believe it. And I do believe it. Since this encounter, I have a sense of quiet calm. I feel more comfortable with myself than I have ever been before. I now know that we are all truly loved in ways that we cannot imagine on this physical plane. And now, finally, I accept this truth. Jeanette. The earth is like a one-room schoolhouse in which students of different grade levels are assembled together. First graders coexist with college seniors, remedial students with the gifted. Its courses are taught in every language and cover every subject. Students of all nationalities and all races attend this school. Every human does. All are on the path toward a spiritual graduation. The lessons in this school are difficult because here we have bodies, so we experience illness, death, loss, pain, separation, and so many other states of suffering. Yet the earth also has such powerful redeeming virtues, like incredible beauty, physical love, unconditional love, soulmates, pleasure for all our senses, kind and compassionate people, and the opportunity for accelerated spiritual growth. Eventually, over the course of many lifetimes, we will learn all these lessons. Our education will be complete, and we will not need to reincarnate anymore. Jeanette provides a glimpse into how our education continues on the other side, even after our consciousness has left the physical body. The earth is a school, a difficult and popular one, but not the only one. In those higher realms, we do not learn through bodily sensations or emotions or relationships or illness. There, our studies are more abstract and conceptual. We discover the advanced dimensions that exist beyond our human awareness, and we begin to unlock their many mysteries. There, we see and feel the sublime manifestations of what on earth appears to be solid and material, and we acquire an understanding of these absolute energies at their most elevated vibration. There we explore the nuances and levels of loving kindness. Compared to Earth and its physical forms, it is learning at a higher octave. Even though these lessons are the graduate-level courses, they are still part of our soul's curriculum. Our knowledge is always expanding. Joe tells Jeanette that he has incurred a debt for taking his own life. He probably left a healthy body when he committed suicide. His consciousness, of course, was not hurt or damaged, but without a body, it cannot do its work on the earth plane. The body is essential for the soul's manifestation in a physical dimension. Joe's soul must wait for its next incarnation to continue its spiritual journey on the earth. But it is not punished with eternal damnation or obliteration. Karma is for learning, not for punishment. And so Joe is assigned to work with the spirits of people who have died from AIDS. Here are people who have suffered greatly, dying too young because their bodies have become irreparably damaged from a horrible disease. What better way for Joe to learn the value of a healthy body, of the gift of life? While working with the souls of the victims of AIDS, Joe was not in pain or distress. He was filled with unconditional love. He was, in a sense, earning his wings, like an angelic being. He was erasing his karmic debts. If Joe, with all his debts and flaws, could make the transition from human to angel, then we all can. For truly, we are all angels temporarily hiding as humans. In her story, Jeanette mentions her encounter with Rachel, who had a special message to give her. Next, Rachel tells how she received that message. Tell her I love her. At the Omega Institute training, I was regressed one evening and taken, in my mind, to a beautiful garden with daisies. There I spent some time speaking with my guides, who watched me with love and happiness. I was given messages about my back pain and feelings of control. After a while, I was ready to leave this realm, but I had the feeling that I needed to wait. This is when I felt a spirit come to talk with me. I knew it wasn't anything to do with me. He had a message for Jeanette. Tell her I love her, he said to me. I was prompted to ask his name. It was Joe. I was highly skeptical about that, as it almost seemed too generic. It may as well have been John Doe. Nonetheless, I could clearly envision what he looked like. He appeared to me an older man with short, curly, whitish-gray hair, olive skin, and a broad chest. He danced a jig from happiness because I promised I would pass the message on. Unfortunately, only 2 days into a training of well over 100 people, I had no idea who Jeanette was. I have received messages before, but only in dreams, and nothing as clear as this. As with all the messages that I've had in the past, they nag at me until I do something about them. I didn't find Jeanette that evening, and so the nagging continued. When I was going to sleep, I asked that Joe go into holding until the morning, when he could pester me again. I have no idea where that idea of a holding came from, or even if there is such a place, but I had a fairly restful sleep. An hour before my alarm went off, I was awake, and Joe was in my ear about Jeanette. Once I had delivered the message, confirming that Jeanette did know Joe, I asked him to leave and go to the light. He wanted to stay and help me, even though I didn't want him to. Joe explained that helping me was his way of saying thank you, as well as part of his own spiritual healing. It was something he needed to do, and I had no intention of stopping him on his journey. By the end of that day, he was done helping my angels get messages through to me. Rachel. Our rational minds often attempt to minimize or even negate the mystical, spiritual, or psychic encounters that we have. We forget the immediacy and the power of our own experience. If we receive validation and confirmation, we are able to let go of our doubts and embrace the reality of the event. Rachel was pushed by Joe to confirm Jeanette's reunion during her regression. Jeanette also knew that their meeting in her kitchen was not her imagination. Joe was helping her, healing her, and emanating his eternal love for her. The messages from Joe and from the other energies were not only for Jeanette. They are for all of us. You are loved. You are worthy. We all are. Do not let your own mind minimize or negate this reality. Faith, whose story follows, also received an important message from the other side. Passing it along to its intended recipients allowed her to validate not only her psychic impressions, but also the important truth that our loved ones are always with us. Messages from Beyond. The second day of your workshop in Los Angeles in 2002 started with a regression. Microphones were scattered around so that people could talk about what they had experienced after the regression ended. Across the room, a woman stood up at the microphone and told how she had come that weekend because her daughter had recently died from cancer. As she was talking, I kept seeing a light behind her. I tried to shake it off, but each time I did, it became brighter, until finally it resolved into a very pretty girl with brown hair and blue eyes who was standing just behind the woman. The girl was looking right at me. I knew that I had to find this woman and tell her. During the break, I walked into the hallway, and even though there were 500 people at the event, the only people in the hall were this woman and her husband. First, I described the girl whom I had seen behind her in exact detail. The woman and her husband were both crying as she pulled a picture from her purse and showed me an image of her daughter. It was the girl whom I had just perfectly described. I then told her that she wasn't imagining it when she thought she heard giggling as the water splashed on her while doing the dishes, that when she was making the bed and thought she felt herself being tickled, she was, and that when she was sitting and reading or watching television and thought that she felt a hug or head on her shoulder, she really did. The husband couldn't speak by this point. The woman told me that even though he didn't believe in any of this stuff, he had bought tickets for them to come to the weekend because he felt he should. When she had wanted to go outside during the break, he wouldn't let her leave the hallway where we now stood, so they had hung around and looked at the art. All the things that I had described to her were things that she had told her husband and no one else, things that she had been feeling happen around the house. Of course, by now we were all crying. I smiled and said, "For whatever reason, your daughter chose me to tell you what I just did." I am not someone who sees or speaks with ghosts, but this young woman unquestionably passed a message to her parents through me. It wasn't until I went back into the workshop room and sat down that I realized just how altered my state had been when I received those messages. From where I was seated, there was absolutely no physically possible way that I could have seen that woman at the microphone. There were 2 support columns in the room. I was sitting on the far left, and the microphone was placed behind the one on the far right. It was an impossibility for me to have seen her standing there. Yet I did. I needed to see her daughter, and I needed to be the messenger that day and bring a measure of peace to her and her husband's pain. Faith Susan. Every one of us possesses intuitional abilities and powers far beyond what we know. Faith is not a professional medium or psychic, but as she entered the altered state, her vision became clairvoyant and unobstructed by physical barriers. She saw and heard with her heart as well as her eyes and ears. And the little girl's father trusted his intuition to get the tickets to the event and to linger in the hallway, even though he didn't yet know why. If we do not follow our intuition, we create obstacles and opposition, and oftentimes this can be dangerous. But if we follow our heart, we flow with the process. We do not force or block, much like the Taoist principle of Wu Wei. Spiritual beings strive to understand and flow with the process, not struggle against it. The little brown-haired girl wanted to comfort her parents, to ease their grief. Because the 3 adults opened their minds and trusted their intuition, the comfort was received. When in doubt, choose from the heart, not from the head. The Delicate Little Flower. I went to your Omega workshop in July of 2009. I want to thank you for showing a great interest in my ongoing medical issues and for taking the time to guide me through a one-on-one regression therapy session. After the regression, it took me a few days to begin processing everything. I began to make connections specifically to the lifetime where I was just a small child in the field of yellow flowers, which were poisonous and which I mistakenly ate. My mother, the same one I have in this lifetime, killed herself upon my death, for she was so distraught that she hadn't been able to save me. She was overprotective in this lifetime, as we discussed, and soon I began to remember things that she had told me when I was growing up. I remembered that she had shared with me that after I was conceived, my parents decided to separate, unaware that my mother was pregnant. Once my mother discovered the pregnancy, the discussion began about terminating it. Her friends and family and my father tried to convince her that going through with it on her own would be a mistake. However, my mother responded that although she didn't know why, she knew she could never terminate the baby, and as hard as it was going to be for her on her own, she had to have it. She always told me that she had a strong feeling that she needed to bring me into this world. I also remembered that my mother had shared with me that she was extremely paranoid about me while I was in utero. She would often not feel me move for a period of time, which would send her straight to the doctor in fear that I was not alive. She was constantly afraid that I wasn't going to make it. In addition, I was often sick as a child, and many times this resulted in a hospital stay. Each time I was hospitalized, my mom worried that I wasn't going to live through it. After I was regressed, I realized that I was born into this life with my mother's preconceived notion that I needed to be taken care of, because of her fear that she was always going to lose me. Oddly enough, I recalled that while I was growing up, my mother used to call me her delicate little flower, as I was so fragile and constantly getting sick. It was somewhat eerie when I remembered this, because you and I had just discovered that in another life I had actually died as a young child from an allergic reaction to eating little yellow flowers. I have not yet discussed all of my experience at Omega with my mom, but I plan to do so. As far as my eating, I am now up to 36 different foods. That's 25 more than I was able to eat before you regressed me. It is a slow process, but I couldn't be happier, and am looking forward to being able to eat many more. I am still continuing to try new food, and I am having success after not being able to eat certain things for over 3 years. My body has been healing ever since that day. I also wanted to let you know that after the regression, many people approached me and told me that my regression had helped them. This made me think of your words when you said that we were all brought together for a purpose. Nikki Destillo. We have lived before alongside many of the people with whom we live now. Our souls have reincarnated together. When a situation occurs that reminds us of a past life trauma, the seeds of our suffering are watered and our anxieties bloom. We fear what has already happened because we have forgotten the past. We mistakenly believe that the traumatic event will happen in the present or in the future. Whenever I encounter obsessively overprotective and controlling parents, my focus shifts to the past life causes. Overwhelmingly, the cure to their fears lies in those buried memories. The parents' worries are allayed, and the child, now liberated, can begin to prosper. The key to the future is often hidden in the past. At that workshop, Nikki recalled another tragic past life in which she died early. Amazingly, another woman who was attending and who had never met Nikki remembered the exact same lifetime. Her story is next. The world works in mysterious ways. Love, loss, and lifetimes. In July of 2009, I was fortunate enough to be able to attend your seminar. I knew that a whole weekend with you was going to be an exciting experience, and it exceeded my expectations by far. The last day was the most profound. In my regression, I felt a constant burning in my stomach and tightening in my chest. It was difficult to breathe. I saw a farmhouse in the distance as I walked over a fog-covered bridge. I was a young woman with beautiful features. I stood in the grass, away from the house, feeling great anxiety about entering it. The burning in my stomach and the tightness in my chest remained. And then I was taken to my last day of life. I was young, perhaps in my early 20s, wearing a crisp white dress, like a nightgown. I had long, dark hair. I was leaving someone whom I loved dearly and romantically. It was so sad, but somehow I knew that I had to leave him. Suddenly, as I left that life, I felt Vincent's presence. Vincent is a dear friend, a man whom I was just beginning to recognize as my soulmate. Later that day, a young woman named Nikki came onto the stage for a regression with you. How strange, I had thought. Vincent's daughter, with whom he is very close, is also named Nikki. As she sat on the stage with you, Nikki described a problem that she had had her entire life with swallowing and eating food. She had consulted many doctors about it, but none could find any physical reasons for her problem. You regressed her to a past life in which she was a child. She was choking on a flower, and her mother had to try to pull it out of her throat. It was revealed that the flower was poisonous. The little girl had died as a result. The girl's mother, who happened to be Nikki's mother in this lifetime as well, committed suicide over her grief. Remember my burning stomach and tight chest, my inability to breathe well? I thought it was so odd that I had just felt those very feelings, and here Nikki was feeling them in a regression. But my mouth went dry as you regressed her to an even earlier time. I was beginning to fidget and to grip my journal. The woman next to me asked what was wrong. I asked her to read the description of the regression I had had earlier that day, which I had written down. Nikki was describing herself as a man. She was swinging happily in circles with a girl who wore a white dress and had long, dark hair. She loved this girl very much. As you moved her forward, she described the old farmhouse that I had seen in my regression. She stood, almost like I had, not wanting to go into the house. She was afraid. Something bad was happening in there. You finally coaxed her inside, and she described the girl as I had seen myself, lying on the bed, dying. She had been poisoned. Nikki felt the great loss of such love. By the time Nikki's regression ended, I was crying, and the woman next to me had finished reading what I had written that morning. She said that I had to share this with you and Nikki, but I did not want to. Nikki had had such emotional memories. I did not want to tell her my experience. I had been such a skeptic of this whole thing, and I worried that others would find me an opportunist of some sort for seeking 5 minutes of your attention. Nonetheless, the woman asked for the microphone and promptly handed it to me. "It's strange about Nikki," I started hesitantly. She described exactly the scene I observed when I saw the farm. Nikki was a man standing at the same faraway distance. He was upset because he was going to lose his wife. She was dying, and he was devastated, so sad for the rest of his life. When I was dying in my regression this morning, I was so upset to be leaving my husband. I felt like we didn't have enough time, that something was unfinished. I felt a burning in my stomach and a tightening in my chest. My throat was so tight it made it hard to breathe. I had a hard time relaying my regression to Nikki. I cried and at times choked on my words. Later, I sought her out in the crowd to introduce myself. I asked her if it would be okay to give her a hug, but she had a protective friend with her who immediately said that I could not, that Nikki had problems with hugging because it made her feel like she was choking or that she could not breathe. Nikki, however, gave me a big smile, and she hugged me tight for a good long time. Shannon. In my recollection, Nikki's diet was extremely affected by her past life death from eating the little yellow flowers as a child. She could only eat 11 different foods and would have severe allergic reactions if she consumed anything else. It was nearly impossible for her to go to restaurants. Her life was limited and constricted by this problem. Within days after her regression, her diet expanded to 15 different foods, within a month to 24. And then, eventually, to 36. It was not by chance or coincidence that Shannon, a complete stranger to Nikki, was in the same group that weekend. Such strong confirming memories, even physical symptoms, were shared. I am sure that Shannon is no longer a skeptic. Vincent, a soulmate whose daughter is also named Nikki, was also around, teaching about eternal love. We are not just our bodies or our brains, but expansive spiritual beings. Perhaps it was Vincent's higher self that was helping and orchestrating Shannon's experiences that weekend. Wouldn't a soulmate want to help open the mind and the heart of his skeptical loved one? Nikki's friend, not yet realizing that the regression to those two past lives had already begun the therapeutic process, was being protective. But Nikki, intuitively aware that she was healing and feeling better, overruled the friend and was able to happily hug Shannon. These two women were both learning about soulmates reconnected, about eternal bonds of love, about transcending death. The good long hug expressed their mutual understanding and transformation. It does not happen very frequently that two people, often strangers, remember the same past lives. However, when it does, it provides even more validation that those lives were indeed real. They are not imagination or fantasy, not metaphor or symbol. Since we have lived hundreds or even thousands of lifetimes, it is not unrealistic to find that we have shared some of them together, just as we all share parts of this current one. In medicine, we have a saying, "When you hear hoofbeats, don't look for zebras." This means that you should look for horses, or, in other words, the most probable explanation, before considering a more exotic possibility. There are several ways to account for the occurrence of shared past life memories, but they are zebras. For example, the memories could be attributed to the collective unconscious, Carl Jung's concept that at some deeper level everybody knows everything, even if we have forgotten how to access that bank of infinite knowledge. The American psychic Edgar Cayce, as well as others, has written about the Akashic records, which is similar to the collective unconscious in that it is a knowledge of all things. But the most realistic explanation, the horse, is that these are simply actual past lives. The specificity of detail found in each regression and the healings that occur as a result lend additional support to this view. We are not limited to regressing to our own lifetimes, whether shared or individual. In the next story, Raymond found that he was able to visualize the past life of another person, someone whom he had not even known the week prior. Miracles happen when we set our minds free. The Shivite Symbol. At your professional training in Austin, Texas, I personally experienced high-definition regressions that altered my life for the better. I also had an unplanned shared consciousness event with a complete stranger. That event is etched in my mind forever. The stranger I have mentioned was another man who was attending your training at the same time I was. My wife and I had sat at mealtimes beside this very fine fellow, who was a psychiatrist from Canada. His story is my story. As this man and I talked at supper one night, he was somewhat saddened by the fact that he was having no regressions, while I had related mine to him and had expressed to him that I was in disbelief, if not shock, from everything that I had encountered. I began to feel a strong empathy for him, and I found myself quite concerned that he find his way to an experience. Part of this was that I recognized that his ability to do so could have a great impact on his patients as well as on himself. His situation stayed on my mind and in my heart. During a coffee break at one of the sessions, I stumbled across Brian and Carol out back of the building and tried to excuse myself. They would have none of it, and so I told them of the psychiatrist and the good that I thought he could do should he have a regression. The next day, Brian called him up for a demonstration in front of the class, and he had a marvelous and detailed regression, during which he was being trained by a holy man in ancient India, many centuries ago, in order to assume his place as a provincial ruler. He went on to have a coronation ceremony. The detail was remarkable. I was so happy that Brian had undertaken the regression for the psychiatrist, and I sat through the majority of it with my eyes shut, grateful to the extent that I guess you could call it relief. While my eyes were shut, I had the sudden picture in my head of some oddly shaped symbol, which looked like a bug. It was quite distinct and clear, but I had no idea what it was or why it would appear during this fellow's regression. That evening, my wife and I sat with the psychiatrist at supper. I told him how glad I was for him, and he told me how he was undergoing the transitional type of thinking that I had had earlier in the week upon first experiencing a past life. As we discussed his regression, I mentioned the weird symbol that I had seen while he had been hypnotized. He asked me what it was. I told him that I had no clue, but could draw it for him. I took a napkin and drew it, and he got a look on his face that I cannot describe. Somewhat astonished and serious at the same time, he stated, "That is the symbol that was on the flags at my coronation." He did not know what it was, nor did I. By this time in the week, I had resigned myself to being freaked out about my experience of being regressed, but this was too much. Now I was experiencing shared consciousness with a total stranger. I spent the next several years trying to find out what the symbol meant. I wrote to universities in India. I called people, never telling them the truth, but simply saying, "I saw this somewhere and was trying to figure out what it was." No one had any clue. My wife and I went on an Alaskan cruise, and prior to going, I signed us up for a Reiki class in Seattle. Bear in mind, before attending your past life regression seminar, I thought that such people were nuts. Odd how experience can humble and enlighten. As we left the Reiki class, we asked the instructor if she knew where any coffee shops were in Seattle, and she said that the one she was familiar with was kind of different, as it served Indian food and was in a unique part of town. We got directions and went. I asked several people there if they had ever seen the symbol before as I drew pictures of it for them. They had not. As we prepared to leave, we went over to the old bookstore part of the shop, and when I checked out, the fellow at the counter said, "Did you find everything you need?" I replied, "Everything except the one thing I was looking for." He inquired what it was, stating that he was well versed in India's history, and asked me to draw it for him. And so I did. He knew immediately what it was, a small sect's portrayal of a Shaivite symbol. It had only been drawn by a limited number of people. 5 years after seeing the symbol in a stranger's regression, I was finally led to another stranger who could explain it. Raymond Wilson. Raymond's fascinating story reveals how his empathetic connection to the Canadian psychiatrist opened his own intuitive capacities. With his eyes gently closed during the other's regression, he rather suddenly saw the oddly shaped Shaivite symbol. The psychiatrist validated Raymond's vision at dinner that evening. 5 years later, Raymond received a second validation at the old bookstore in Seattle. After reading this account, I remembered that after returning home from that Texas workshop, I had dictated some of my own recollections of that week's experiences. I quickly found my notes about Nikhil, the psychiatrist. Nikhil's first past life memory was from about 2,500 years ago in ancient India. Nikhil was a 6-year-old boy surrounded by other children, one of whom was his best friend. He could see the guru of the place where he lived. The guru wore no shirt but a string of sandalwood beads, which Nikhil could smell. His senses had become heightened during the regression. The guru taught the boys lessons, and later Nikhil collected firewood and performed other chores. Sitting around the fire, holding hands in a circle, he heard and was able to repeat to the entire workshop group the guru's teachings about humility, simplicity, giving, compassion, and kindness. Nikhil had a second past life memory in India, in which he was the prince of a small kingdom. In that life, his best friend had sacrificed his life in a battle in order to save the life of Nikhil. In his current life, this friend is his sister-in-law. This memory helped to explain much of their relationship, the immediate connection and the sense of safety, security, and deep friendship. Raymond's journey of validation took 5 years, until the Shaivite symbol was identified. Nikhil's transformation was immediate, especially as he remembered and incorporated the 2,500-year-old wisdom. These teachings are age-old, yet they could not be more relevant today. They are the lessons of the Masters shared with us through Catherine, and they are the lessons of all great spiritual traditions. We are to be humble, kind, generous, and compassionate. We are spiritual beings, and this is how spiritual beings feel and act. This is timeless wisdom, and this is how we can save the world. Raymond could see into Nikhil's past life and envision the symbol displayed on his coronation flags. While watching a female workshop participant undergo a regression, Eileen, who tells her story next, opened her own intuitive eyes to find the face of an ancient male monk looking back at her. Past life regressions are quite literally transformative. Eileen accomplished this feat spontaneously, but in my book, Through Time into Healing, I describe an exercise called Faces that can enable you to experience it for yourself. Sit a few feet across from a friend, with the lights dim and with soft music in the background. Look into the other person's face. Watch to see if the person's face changes. Observe and describe the changes you see. Features often do appear to change. Eyes, noses, and hairstyles dissolve and reform. Headgear sometimes appears. You can also try this exercise alone, by using a mirror and observing the changes you see in your own face. The only secret to faces is to make sure you try it in a dimly lit room. This frees up the left brain and allows easier passage of intuitive impressions. Faces can provide clues to many different past lives. As in other methods, meditation, visualization, and/or free association to the observed changes can fill out the memory. Let them expand and develop without censoring the material. A face may become a group of faces, or a whole scene may unfold behind the face. You may hear a voice or an important word. Try it and see. A Monk's Wisdom. I was at a workshop in New York State in 2008. I didn't have any past life memories, but I did experience profound meditations during those group sessions, as well as a very interesting meditation one evening with another participant. I was not a practitioner and had gone there on my own. One of the participants, a woman named Erin, was upset about two of her past life memories, of which I knew nothing. I only knew that she was saddened. The next day, Brian regressed Erin to a prior lifetime that was rather criminal and violent. She sensed death and corruption, firearms even. It was not a nice place to be. Another memory was of being a man in Southeast Asia, working on the land and the water, feeling lonely. Much sadness and dark shadows were in these memories, and loneliness prevailed. The next regression was to a place that would throw light on or explain these two regressions that brought such sadness. Erin found herself in a place of great learning, an ancient library with people sitting around a huge table and writing in all languages. Books of learning and knowing were kept here. They had to be hidden away in case of attack or war. She spoke of this place containing the truths of the world. As the regression was occurring on the stage, I looked at Erin and stopped seeing her face and body. Instead, I saw the face and body of a monk. This monk's head was huge, and his eyebrows were very long, fine, dark, and pronounced. His face was highly intelligent and clear-skinned. I blinked my eyes numerous times to see if I was being deceived by angles or light, but he remained. He was a big man, wearing a brown monk's habit that had a huge fold-over V-necked collar running from shoulder to shoulder. The monk, as Erin, spoke these words of wisdom. All religions have boundaries which are causing divisions, and this is not the purpose. We must look beyond the boundaries, beyond the narrowness. We must know the truth that life is eternal, and that these are important times on earth. The truth of knowing is that we are all one. We must become aware of the knowing and the truths and seek union, not separation. Knowing is deeper almost than wisdom, as it is an internal shift in perception. I knew the implication of the words. I knew that knowing is union with the deep soul and God within. There was not a sound in that room. Perceptions were extremely heightened, especially for me. I had the idea that the place where Erin was had high walls with ladders to the volumes. I think that she said this. I also had the idea that this place was ancient and somewhere on earth. I am not sure if she said this, but I recollect the image in my mind. When she was brought back, the monk disappeared, and there Erin was again. Brian told Erin that she had experienced the sad lives because it was necessary for her to have the understanding of those things in her life journey, that all of this was for her learning on earth. It was important for her to know that she was highly developed. I had sketched an outline of the head of the monk. It was nothing more than bare lines on my notepad. I felt the urge to speak with her, but we then all went into the group progressions to 200 and 2,000 years ahead, and there I was again in the stars. I felt compelled to ask Erin about the place she had seen and if she had been with monks. I managed to speak to her by pushing in front of someone who was already talking with her. I was a bit rude, but I had to leave immediately and wanted to ask. Erin told me that the place she had seen was somewhere between England and Scotland. I wondered if it was Lindisfarne, which is near the borders of England and Scotland, so I asked her to sketch the place on my notepad. She did. She drew the outline of the British Isles and the European continent. She showed an island to the very southwest of the British Isles, and then she drew the North American continent. This island off the southwest of the British Isles, which is Cornwall, and which is around the Scilly Isles, she drew in harder outline, and then she drew some smaller islands to the east side of the North American continent. She said that what she had seen was on this island, the one near the Scilly Isles. I was quite astonished because this is the reputed area of Avalon, beyond the Scilly Isles and where King Arthur rests. I realized that Erin spoke of Scotland and England because most people didn't know about the British Isles, which is why I had first thought of Lindisfarne. But she meant the southwestern region and those long, hidden islands west of the Scilly Isles. This I found amazing. Afterward, I pondered all these things and tried to recollect everything. I am aware of knowing being beyond earthly perceptions, and the deep truths and words of the monk were of such things. My knowledge of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table is such that, whilst I am aware it is legend, I am equally aware that the stories come from the Druids, who were based in England beyond 5,000 years ago, and that the family of Arthur was pagan, Druid, and of the old religions, Merlin. Arthur brought together the old and the new. When Christianity came to the British Isles, he signified the unifying force of the two coming together. Where I live now in Brittany was equally a Druid place, and in fact the Druids are still here. Much of the land has not been developed industrially, so there are ancient places, untouched, including an area of graves and other stones from at least 3,000 years ago. There are many holy wells in this area that date from before Christianity. When Christianity came, the wells were kept for religious purposes and churches were built nearby, so the link between the old and the new was a unifying force, not a separating one. Indeed, there is a chapel near me that was originally a Druid worship place. Then, when the Romans came, it was turned into a chapel to Venus, and later on it became a Christian church. This fascinates me because it shows the seamless adaptation of monuments and ancient holy places of worship from age to age, without conflict or division. And this, of course, makes me think of the profound words of the monk that I saw in Erin. Eileen de Bruin. Eileen observed the monk in Erin just as effortlessly as she observed the metamorphosis from nature's cathedral to temple to chapel to church. I remember once visiting a mosque built upon the ruins of a Christian church, which had been built upon the ruins of a Roman temple, which itself had been built upon the ruins of an even more ancient Greek temple. Archaeological reincarnation manifested as seamlessly as the reincarnation of our souls, just as Eileen has described. During her regression, Erin spoke, as the monk, of how religions often divide, whereas spirituality unifies and connects. Whether it is Nikhil echoing his long-ago guru or Aaron, the primal druidic knowledge, the messages are so similar. We must treat each other as loving family, because we are the same. Each one of us is connected. We have walked on the moon, and we have split the atom, yet we still discriminate and wage wars in the name of religion. We seem to only see the differences in our faiths and not the shared truths. We miss the forest for the trees. There is a classic parable in which blind men were permitted to feel only one part of an elephant, and were then asked to describe an elephant's form and nature. Some men felt the tail, and declared an elephant to be like a rope. Those who touched the trunk deemed it a snake. The ones touching its leg thought it to be like a pillar, and the ones who felt its ears and tusks had their own differing thoughts. All were correct, yet all were wrong. They were right about the particular features, but not about the whole. It is as if we were those blind men. To find the spiritual core of our religion, the whole is more important than the particular parts. Erin speaks precisely of this core when she says, "We must know the truth that life is eternal. The truth of knowing is that we are all one, and seek union, not separation." Remembering our past lives and the mystical state after death allows such knowing. Knowing is so much deeper than belief, reason, or logic. It is the fruit of direct experience, and its power is immense. It heals and it liberates. Knowing the truth of our spiritual essence can soothe the world and bring about peace, because those who know will renounce violence and embrace compassion. Life is eternal. We are all one. To hate or to harm another is to hate and harm yourself. Violence harms us immediately, because we are all connected. Violence also harms us subsequently because its karmic debt has to be repaid, often in a future lifetime. And what happens when we allow religion or nationality or other similar characteristics to become the basis for such violence? We need only turn on the news to find the answer. The author of the final story of this chapter remembered a past life in the Holocaust, and her account certainly offers another example. However, and even more important, it presents the antithesis, a world where we transcend our divisions rather than perpetuate them, where we unite together to form one loving and loved whole, and where everyone matters, everyone is equal, and where there are no barriers to separate us. Community. It took me years and the accumulation of many synchronistic moments to arrange my schedule as a parish minister in order for me to attend Brian and Carol's past life regression therapy workshop at Omega Institute. Having incorporated hypnotherapy and Reiki into my parish ministry, I thought that it might be interesting to add regression therapy to my repertoire of skills. Needless to say, I never expected the workshop to change my life in so many different ways. The first morning, Brian regressed the group. After going to a childhood memory and then back to the womb, he presented us with a door to our past lives. When I went through it, I wasn't prepared for what I was about to experience. Looking down at my feet, I saw that they clearly belonged to a mature woman of fairly comfortable financial means. The shoes were burnished brown dress shoes of leather, in a sturdy but somewhat sophisticated style. The hose were a heavy nylon blend that reminded me of the kind that my grandmother used to wear. I was wearing a straight mid-calf brown wool skirt, a cream-colored blouse, and a strand of pearls and clip-on pearl earrings. My hair was brown as well, and it was drawn back in a roll that went from the sides of my head along the nape of my neck, forming a kind of U in the back of my head. I couldn't figure out how I got it to look that way. I was relatively slender and around 5'5", neither of which describes me now. I was standing near a window in what appeared to be my living or dining room. It was clearly the top floor of the apartment building, as I was looking down toward the street below. The building across the street was similarly structured, and the facade was made out of stone or cement, with some decorative molding along the roofline and across the window tops. This was clearly a cityscape. The room that I was in had high ceilings. The furniture was heavy but elegant in its own fashion. A crystal chandelier hung over a dark wood dining table. On the table were strewn family pictures, jewelry, candlesticks, and other small objects. Several adult children and their spouses anxiously moved around. The kids were playing and chasing each other, but their parents seemed very agitated. We were waiting for something when my husband came through the door and announced that we needed to gather what we could and report to the train station in 1 hour. We were being deported to a work camp. My husband looked like my present husband, only taller and more slender. Brian had us move forward in the regression, and I found myself waiting at the train station and then in the cattle car. There was a horrible combination of fear, physical pain, terror, and claustrophobia. I felt like I was being crushed, which coincidentally is a phobia I've had during my entire present life. As Brian brought us out of the regression, my tears came down in torrents. On the second day of the workshop, Carol was looking for people who had had a regression experience on the first day and who would be willing to work with her in front of the group. I told her my story as I limped forward with a cane due to a chronic knee problem and a recently crippling back ailment. She chose me to be her client, and we decided to go deeper into my first regression. I got a bit panicky, worrying that I wouldn't be able to get hypnotized, that I would only see a blank wall, or that being in front of the group would interfere with my ability to experience anything. Quite the contrary happened. The induction was like a slide into the deepest relaxation I had ever experienced. Carol expertly guided me back to that memory of the train tracks. I learned that my husband was a doctor and that I had been his nurse. There was incredible chaos at the train station, with Nazi soldiers barking orders. People were terrified, children were crying, and everyone seemed to be turning to my husband and me for information and for calm. When we saw the cattle cars pull up, the sheer terror of it all started to corrode my otherwise stalwart character, but I tried very hard to hold it all in. The conditions were horrific. A bucket in the corner for urine and feces, one small window to let in light and air. The soldiers crammed as many bodies into the car as possible, and everyone was screaming to hold up the children so that they wouldn't get crushed. It was impossible to sit down. There wasn't any room. My legs and back hurt terribly, just as they do in this lifetime, but I kept trying to soothe the grandchildren. I begged my children to have faith that God would protect us. I thought it couldn't get any worse. I was wrong. The train arrived at a camp far away. We had traveled for hours, and it was difficult to climb down and walk. Everyone was disheveled, dirty, hungry, and scared. There was initial chaos and then more shouting of orders. This is when we were separated. The women began to scream when our husbands were taken from us, but nothing prepared us for the children being ripped away. They told us they would all be together in a nursery, but by then none of us believed anything we were told. My daughters, daughter-in-law, and I, along with some of the other women we knew, were taken to a building where we were obligated to hand over our suitcases and give up our clothes. We were naked and cold. Someone lined us up to cut our hair, to avoid lice, they said, and we were marched into a large room for showers. The water was cold, and there was no soap. Afterward, we were given rough, scratchy shifts to put on. No towels. It was humiliating and degrading. As Carol guided me through this nightmare, I remembered telling the officers at the camp that I was a nurse. I had heard that my husband was working as a doctor in the men's infirmary. But instead of using me in my professional capacity, they made me join the others and help move rocks to build a road. It severely hurt my back. Carol then brought me to my death. I did not die in the gas chambers. I died in the women's infirmary. I saw my husband one last time in the distance, and our eyes locked momentarily. I learned that he had found a way to get me into the infirmary. Had he bribed someone? My lungs were filled with fluid. My hands and feet were cold, dirty, and filled with sores. I was, at least, on a cot. Yet I also remember that the few women who tried to attend to me were kind, even though they didn't have anything to help treat my condition. I was so appreciative that they just left me alone. I had tried my best to comfort and sustain those I met in the camps, even though I always felt that I couldn't do enough. I was grateful to die with a shred of dignity. I didn't know what happened to the rest of my family, but it almost didn't matter. I knew we were connected in ways that even the Nazis couldn't destroy. Death was welcome. Needless to say, it was a very emotional and informative session. For my whole life, I have suffered from a fear of being yelled at, scolded, or ridiculed. After such an episode, I feel like a dog that has been whipped, and feelings of guilt and shame and fear fill me. Every cell in my body responds. Just before writing this, as I was going home from church, there was a policeman directing traffic at the end of the street. It is always difficult to make a left-hand turn there, and I was thrilled that he could stop the traffic. As I was turning past him, he yelled, "Come on!" I felt sick all the way home. Why did he yell at me? I was going as fast as I could. It made me feel terrible inside. Then I remembered my past life regression to the Holocaust. I could hear the guards screaming at me to move faster, calling me names, making me feel inadequate and shameful. It was such an incredible revelation for me. I continue to feel a powerful healing process in my body and my spirit. I can't wait to continue this work on myself, and I see the tremendous potential for insight and healing for others. This regression was a great gift that was given to my life. But the story does not end there. Early in the morning of our last day together at Omega, I asked my guides, in meditation, to give me some names for validation. I received the names Ruth and Chaim, or Hermann. I'm not entirely sure. I asked for a last name so I could check the list of Holocaust victims at Yad Vashem. I repeatedly got the word Gemeinschaft. At first I didn't even know how to spell it, yet the word flowed from my pen. I kept coming up with different variations in my head, but Gemeinschaft continued flashing at me. Later that evening, I frantically searched the database but couldn't find anyone with that last name. I was so disappointed. I searched everywhere but kept getting blanks. Still, the word was screaming in my head. So, at midnight, frustrated and sad, I decided to see if Gemeinschaft was a word at all. What I discovered gave me chills. Gemeinschaft was first coined by a German sociologist in the late 1800s. It means community. The doctrine of Gemeinschaft is about a living organism, a real and organic community where people are connected to one another because of beliefs, cultural ties, or other identifying markers. In Gemeinschaft, everyone matters, everyone is equal, and everyone has something to contribute to the whole. Gemeinschaft transcends society, and when you are part of this community, wherever you are recognized as being an intrinsic member of it. It is about the beloved community, one where there are no barriers that separate us. I felt like my guides were sending me a message that was more important than a last name. I'd still like to do more regression work because I feel that there's so much more that I need and want to learn. But in the meantime, I'm going to take this message to heart and see where it takes me. Certainly, the community that we created at Omega was Gemeinschaft to the 10th degree. Cindy Fredo. Although her pain lessened and her sleeping improved, the striking aspect of Cindy's regressions was the extraordinary level and acuity of detail. She could see, smell, feel, taste, and hear that cattle car. She was ministering to her Jewish Holocaust Gemeinschaft, and in this life she is, in fact, a minister, once again tending to her flock, once again with grace and dignity. Our souls may take on a million different forms. We can become lion or dandelion, plant or person. If we've assumed a human form, we can be any color, any race, any sex. Whichever form we choose, underneath the surface we are exactly the same. We are all connected. We are all the same substance and energy, born of the same source, composed of the same spiritual material. It really is senseless to continue to afflict ourselves with countless wars and violence because we harm ourselves when we harm one another. Nazis have reincarnated as Jews, and German Jews as American Christians, just as in Cindy's 2 lifetimes. We have been the murderers and the murdered, the violent and the victims of violence. If we have had a lifetime of being hurtful, then we have also had a lifetime of being the monk who would never harm even an ant, and now we are living somewhere in between, learning about balance. That is how we evolve. We are often pulled back into the bodies of our enemies to teach us the truth that skin color, nationality, religion, and gender are external trappings that do not belong to the soul. Hatred distorts reality. We have to learn from all sides. When we are born into our enemies' bodies, what choice do we have but to love them? We see their helpless little babies. We watch them tending to their aging grandparents, worrying about having enough food or shelter, and dealing with the same 1,000 details of everyday life that we do. We recognize that they are us. With this wisdom comes peace. Our community, our true Gemeinschaft, is the entire human community, and beyond. Once we look into the eyes of another and see ourselves looking back, we will be able to create a heaven on this earth.